So we're going to talk about the recreational water quality criteria, basically bacteria, and the objectives that EPA established in 2012. I know that they've already been established by California and Hawaii. I don't know if they've been established by Arizona, Nevada. And then, of course, there's a disclaimer, which you guys can probably recite by now. Okay. So the Clean Water Act develops these criteria to protect primary contact recreation. And the criteria are really about protecting people from fecal bacteria contamination. It's really the pathogens, not the bacteria. And there's a lot of ways that bacteria can get into our water bodies, either through point sources or non-point sources. So the EPA's 2012 criteria was all about protecting from fecal contamination, and was really, to be used in two ways. One was for postings, and one is for, Clean Water Act purposes for writing permits and writing TMDLs. So I think it's important to reiterate that, fecal coliform and enterococcus do not make you sick. They're just indicators of poop. And, there's an association with fecal material and a bunch of viruses, protozoas, and bacteria. And a fun fact is that 97% of all waterborne illnesses in the US are associated with about 7 or 8 pathogens. There are things like, I had to write it down, norovirus you've probably heard of, adenovirus, rotavirus, those are the viruses. A couple of protozoa like Cryptosporidium and Giardia you've probably heard of. And then 3 bacteria, Campylobacter, Salmonella, and E. coli 0157H7. And that one is really associated with, cow feces. What else is here? Yeah, so we use indicators because it's really hard to monitor for viruses and all these types of things. And so again, it just reiterates that this is based on bacteria that indicate fecal contamination. We're going to go a little bit into the history. So EPA first established criteria for bacteria in 1968 based on 200 fecal coliform. That number dates all the way back to like 1916 to a cholera epidemic. So that number is really, really, really old. But in the 70s, EPA, Albafor, and Cabelli, I forget, it's Jim Cabelli, did a bunch of epidemiology studies, and that's where we got the 1986 criteria, which was based on epidemiology studies in marine and freshwater, and that's where we got the E. coli of 126 and the Enterococcus of 35, and the E. coli was for freshwater, and the Enterococcus was for marine waters. And the reason the Enterococcus was for marine waters is because the Enterococcus lasted longer in marine waters than E. coli did. So in 2000, Congress passed the BEACH Act. It's a pretty good acronym. You could read it. And it applies to all coastal waters. I didn't know there was 35 coastal waters, but when you count the small New England states and the Great Lakes, you get to 35. And it really required three things. It required EPA to set up a grant program to all states, to monitor beaches. So we give money to California, to Hawaii, to the territories in Region 9. It asked them to promulgate Enterococcus numbers for all the states that had never adopted Enterococcus for the beach. So we did that in 2004 for a number of Region 9 states. And then finally, it asked us to develop bacteria criteria within 5 years. So we got 2 of the things done within the 2005, and then we got sued, and so there was a big effort to develop new epidemiology studies. Yeah, so it says we promulgated for 19 states and 2 territories. Again, this is only marine waters. So why create water quality criteria, recreational water quality criteria? Well, because the Beach Act compelled us to, and we were slow, and we got sued. So that brought money. So we undertook this big epi study with 7 beaches, some freshwater, some marine waters, to really understand what the risk from Enterococcus and E. coli was. And again, it's part of our responsibility under 304A, and now everyone knows what 304A criteria are, right? So there's some words up there like predictive modeling and quantitative microbial risk assessment and new indicators and methods. Those were not part of the epidemiology study, but those are other things that add to the criteria, and so they're in the 2012 document. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I went too fast. So EPA conducted 9, I think I said 7, but I misspoke, 9 epi studies. And basically, these are expensive things to do. You go out for an entire summer at a bunch of these beaches. You ask people questions before they go in the water. You ask people questions weekly. And then at the end, you compare who got sick and the water quality concentration of bacteria. And you develop some sort of relationship to figure out, okay, this is the number that we want to protect to keep people from getting sick. So that's what that line says. Together, health and water quality data determine the strength of relationship between fecal and health effects. So we recommended Enterococcus for marine waters and E. coli for fresh waters. Actually, we recommended Enterococcus for both fresh and marine waters, but we also allowed folks to use E. coli for fresh waters because a lot of folks are still using it. This thing about recommending a uniform illness rate, let me get into that a little bit. So back in 1986, when the epi studies were done, back in 72 when they were done for the 1986 criteria, there were 2 illness rates. So for marine, we had an illness rate of 19 illnesses per 1,000. Right? And for freshwater, we had 8 per 1,000. And it's just what the data gave us at that time. When we did these recent epi studies, we found out that the risks were actually quite similar, and we came up with a number of 36 illnesses. Now you can say, wait, 36 is a lot more than 8 or 19. But in this new epi study, we used a different version of illness rate. So in the previous one, you had to have a fever to be counted as an illness. And so in this one, you didn't have to have a fever. So the number's gonna go up, right? So if you're using the old definition, the illness rate is about 8, but if you're using the new definition of illness, it's 32. Actually 36, I take that back. What else is up here? So we've been using, culturable methods that have been around since Louis Pasteur, right? You take bacteria, you grow it, you wait 24 hours, you post a sign on a beach that says, I don't know what the water quality is today, but yesterday it was this. If you want to know what it is today, come back tomorrow, we'll tell you. So there was a lot of effort to develop faster techniques. And so there's these DNA, RNA techniques called polymerase chain reaction. And we're using a quantitative polymerase chain reaction. And so you get hours within 4 to 6, you can get results within 4 to 6 hours Now, it's still a struggle to get to report to the beach, because imagine a lifeguard goes out at 6 o'clock in the morning, takes a sample. He drives back to the lab. 4 to 6 hours later, he's going to get results. He's going to drive back out. So now the science will say, I don't know what it is now, but 8 hours, you can find out what it was now. And so this is an area of rapid research to figure out how we can get faster, better, cheaper ways to identify the risk at the beach. There's a question in the room behind you.
How quickly does it change at a beach
Well, it depends on the beach.
At freshwater sites?
I know more about marine sites, but at the beach it could change very, very rapidly, right? And a lot of it is sampling error, right? You take a sample and there's a seagull above you and a really high number, right? So just as a rule of thumb, if it rains, it's going to be pretty bad. But if you wait 2 to 3 days, it's going to be clean. So 1, 2, 3 days, that's the time it takes to dissipate. So that's just a good rule of thumb. Yeah.
So are there studies done on, at, like, whether it's like at the beach in San Francisco or the freezing cold Pacific Ocean versus being in Saipan and it's super warm water, or Hawaii? Does the bacteria live longer if it's warmer water, or do you know?
So these studies were done, a number of them were done in the Great Lakes, which is cold. Some were done in tropical waters, which is warm. And so we're trying to generalize the results because we don't want to have a criteria for this beach but not that beach. Zane has a question?
Yeah, so one thing when I was working on this a long time ago, but that I never heard was, what's the baseline for a number of sicknesses? So people who don't, you talk about 32, I'm sorry. Thanks. You talk about 32 people per 1,000 being sick, and I know we had comments like, it should be 0, and it's like, so the water will keep you from getting sick. That'd be great water. So, but what is the baseline for the number of people?
The baseline is about 20.
Okay.
I mean, people get sick at the beach because they were partying the night before. They ate the chicken salad that was sitting in the sun. You know, there's a lot of reason that people get sick, or they're just sick, right? And so you have to incorporate that into the calculation when you do epidemiology study. And so that's what they do. They ask people who didn't go in the water, did you get sick? If you did, check. And so that's how they determine the baseline. But it's about 20. Where am I? Oh, okay, so in addition to the EPA studies, there were some other studies being done in Southern California. There are like 3 epi studies that were done at like San Diego, Avalon, just Southern California beaches. If you want to know the details, I can tell you later. And so they sort of incorporated those into this study, really just to confirm that the numbers they got were pretty good. And I'm looking at this and I lost my place. Of course, you know, like with any criteria, we get stakeholder input, peer review, public comment, and we got all that. So again, these are 304A criteria. You guys all know what that is. It includes inland and coastal waters. It applies only to primary contact wreck. So it does not apply to secondary contact wreck, only primary contact wreck. And that's because some of the assumptions are that there's a certain amount of water that's being ingested when you swim. And most states, you know, designate all their waters as swimming waters, right? Because that's part of Clean Water Act 102, right? You know, all waters shall be fishable and swimmable and propagate life, that kind of stuff. So like all 304A criteria, we have a magnitude, a duration, and a frequency. And again, it's used for Clean Water Act purposes, which means it's used for permits and TMDLs and all sorts of things. But here's the interesting thing. Normally, we have one illness rate. In this one, we developed 2 illness rates. And the reasons for that are super complicated, and I will tell you over a beer at Punch Bowl, but I will not tell you now. So, some of you remember in the old bacteria stuff, we had a geomean and a single sample maximum that was based on the 75th percentile. We decided that concept was wrong, because if you have a distribution and you're at the 75th percentile, you could still be meeting your geomean. So we sort of changed the concept to be away from a single sample maximum to what's called a statistical threshold value. And so we want to keep stuff below this 90th percentile. So if 10% of your samples exceed the 90th percentile, you're exceeding the criteria. If your geomean is greater than, let's say, 35, you're exceeding the criteria. So it's 2 halves of the same criteria. Is that clear? I see heads nodding yes. I see a question, damn it.
Yeah, does the statistical threshold value, is that based on an assumption of a certain frequency of monitoring? As in, if you only monitor once a year, is that still going to capture a 90th percentile such that the geomean would still be within the range of the geomean?
Yeah, it's insensitive to sampling frequency.
Okay.
In the old days, we had, language that says, based on a minimum of 5 samples. And sometimes people would sample 4, so we can't use the data. And that was kind of a silly concept. So what we said is, you could take 100 samples, you could take 1, but you're still going to be guided by the statistical threshold. So it kind of encourages folks to monitor beaches. So these are the 2 illness rates. So you see over, what is that, the right? Yeah. There is a geomean of 35, which is pretty similar to what we've always had for beaches, and a statistical threshold of 130. I have 30 minutes? God, I'll be done. And that's based on 36 illnesses per 1,000 recs. So remember I said before it was 8, so the relationship between 36 and 8 is that 36 is 4.5 times 8, which was the old number, because we did the math. And then another one that was based on 32 illnesses per 1,000, and it's at 30 as a geomean and 110 as a statistical threshold value. Question?
I'll just add real quick that the 32 illnesses per 1,000 is what California recently chose to use for its new objective.
Yeah. I will say one editorial, that in terms of sampling, it's hard to tell the difference between 35 and 30, right? Because the error in the measurement technique is bigger than that. We recommended a 30-day interval for the geomean. We've been a little squishy on that. So some folks have longer than 30 days. California has a 6-week, but 30 days is the recommended. This thing about either static or rolling, who knows the difference between static and rolling? Yes?
You want me to explain it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, say
I
for
can.
example, you have the month of April. You take 4 samples in the month of April. That would be the average or the geomean derived from those 4 samples.
Yeah.
If you take the 1st of April through the 30th of April, that would be the same as the static geomean. Now, if you were to move that window of 4 weeks to the 2nd week of April, so the 7th of April until the 1st of May or the 7th of May, that's the rolling geomean. And if you did that every week, that would be your rolling 4-week geomean.
Yeah.
So the 1st to the 1st, the 7th to the 7th, the 14th to the 14th. So it's
Yeah.
not the fixed calendar month, it moves.
Yeah, the way I like to explain it, if you do like a static, you're going to have 12 geomeans in a year, right? But if you do rolling, you're going to have 52, actually 52 minus the first 3. But yeah. Everybody got that? Okay. So remember I talked about this QPCR? Wait, what am I doing here? Now I'm confused. Oh, these are just the freshwater numbers for 36 and 32. So remember I said that the geomean and statistical threshold values are sort of two sides of the coin. So that's what this is really saying. It's either, right? You can fail both ways. This issue about statewide, we did not want states picking, oh, I want an illness of 30 here and an illness rate of 32 here, right? We wanted to have, if you're going to pick a number state, pick a number. And then this sentence I don't really understand. EPA recommends states select the criteria that most appropriate the risk management decision regarding the illness rate. So there you go.
Okay, I think that means that you don't want to adopt the 36 illnesses per 1,000 over here and the 32 illnesses per 1,000 over there.
Yeah.
Just to kind of choose one.
Okay. So remember I said there's the criteria, and then there's this other piece. And one of those pieces is this quantitative polymerase chain reaction. Polymerase is a hard word to say. And so the epidemiology showed a really good relation between this qPCR number for Enterococcus and illness rate. So we wanted to recommend it. But doing qPCR is hard for many states, right? And even if states can do it, there are things called inhibition that can change a number a little bit. You're basically taking a little piece of RNA and you're replicating it. And so if something gets in there to inhibit it, the rate of replication might be slower. So we basically said you guys could use it if you figure out the techniques and you can deal with the inhibition issue. So that's probably the easiest way for me to say that. And then remember I told you the old 1986 had a geomean and a single sample maximum based on the 75th percentile. So folks wanted to keep that, but only for beach notifications. And so we gave the option of states to use the 75th percentile to notify people that there's something going on at the beach. So those are the numbers for qPCR. These are not, Enterococcus numbers. These are sort of Enterococcus gene copies, right? We're not growing anything. We're just replicating some RNA. Yeah.
Do you know if anybody's actually using the qPCR numbers, maybe not even as a standard, but a way to manage their beaches?
Yeah, so I know the folks in Southern California have dabbled with it. I know that the San Diego Department of Public Health is wanting to use another type of PCR called digital droplet PCR, which is just another way of doing the same thing. And so we're in the process of working with them to make sure that it's copacetic.
Can I just add something? The advantage of the qPCR is that you could potentially get the result, very quickly, and be able to, inform the public of, a problem at the beach, on that same day. Whereas, the 35 is colony-forming units. You have to grow the bacteria in a culture dish. It takes several days, and by the time you know what the answer is, people have already gone home and gotten sick or whatever.
But even with the qPCR, you have to have like a mobile lab and willing folks to.
Right. So that's the challenge right now, is to get that, that technology, refined enough to be able to really have a quick turnaround.
I agree. Oh, these are the beach action values based on the 75th percentile of the old data from 1986 and the new data. So the numbers look a little bit different than folks are used to, but that's what they are. So there's some stuff stuck in the back of the criteria document. They're basically tools for states to use. So we have this issue even with qPCR that it takes 4 to 6 hours. So a lot of folks are beginning to think about maybe we can use models, right? We know when it rains, beach is bad. We know when the wind blows a certain way and there's a source over here, the beach is going to be bad. So let's supplement our sampling with a predictive model. And so there's one in the Great Lakes, and there's one being developed in Southern California. And then finally, if you have bacteria on the beach, you really want to find out where it is. You don't want to just say, hey, it's on the beach, right? And so there's these things called sanitary surveys that have been around forever, and basically, go find the source. I will say if you're using culturable methods, it takes a long time to find the source, right? It's like, oh, that source here. Wait 24 hours, come back. Oh, the source is gone. So the more rapid methods have great potential for these sanitary surveys. And I know that the state board put out a recommendation for sanitary surveys document that's about this big and very, very useful. Yeah, so the other thing is, we develop these things, but the science is changing super, super rapid. New techniques, new indicators, all these types of things. We didn't want to wait another 20 or 30 years to have to produce something to protect public health. So we developed this idea of, site-specific criteria. We have site-specific criteria for metals. Why can't we have site-specific criteria for bacteria? And so we have sort of 3 methods. One, if you want to do your own epidemiological study, go do it, right? So, spend about $1 million, sample, question, develop a thing, bring it to us. We'll look at it. If it's good, we'll approve it. But there's number 2 is a really interesting thing. So everyone knows what risk assessment is, right? So this is quantitative microbial risk assessment. And remember in the beginning I told you there's like 9 pathogens that affect us? So if you happen to know what the density of those 9 critters are, you can do some math magic based on your risk, the infectivity of those critters, and the concentration of those critters to come up with a site-specific value for your beach. So instead of $1 million, it'll cost you $500,000. But you can do it on a statewide or a regional. And then this last bullet is about there's just new ways to measure things, and we're going to find newer things that are better than E. coli or fecal enterococcus, right? And so there's this process at headquarters called the alternative test procedure, which is a great process, but it takes 3 years to go through. So this process is sort of a streamlined one of that. So if you take side-by-side samples, the EPA thing and your new NIDO thing with your new NIDO tool, and you develop a correlation, will allow you to use that new NIDO indicator or tool. So it's just, establishing that this is as protective as ours. And so there's a document on the EPA website that sort of talks about that. And the test is really a correlation or an index of agreement. Oh yeah, so the Beach Act came out in 2012. Congress says do these great things. We did these great things. And they said, oh yeah, we want to have a review every 5 years. And so we did a review in 2017. The review is available online. And we decide, we're not ready right now that there's not enough new science to recommend developing new criteria. But there is this cool thing out there called Coliphage. So Coliphage are basically viruses that attack coliform bacteria. And what's useful about them is that, well, there's a lot of coliform bacteria in wastewater. But when you disinfect, you kill most of the bacteria, right? But you don't kill the viruses, or maybe just knock down the viruses a little bit. So the thought is that these coliphage act more like viruses, which is what we're concerned with. And so there's been a lot of studies to see whether or not we can use coliphage as a better indicator than just, some bacteria that doesn't make you sick. There's a lot of work to be done on that. The studies are kind of incomplete. There's 2 different types of phages, and so it's going to be a little while. Oh, everything I just said is up here. Except this, I did not say this. It's an EPA-approved method, and they use it in groundwater. And I know that the 15 Minutes Cal division of, not the CDFA, the guys that, FDA, the guys that do all the shellfish contamination, are looking at coliphage too, because, measuring bacteria in shellfish is probably not as accurate as this might be. So we've been working on it for the last 9 years. And this says 2019 to derive. We're not deriving the criteria this year, are we? Manjali, do you know? I don't think we are. I think we're ways off.
Which criteria are we talking about?
The coliphage.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
There was a lot of work has been done on it, but some intervening issues.
Yeah.
Some intervening issues kind of came up, and so it's been kind of put on the sidelines, but the hope is that it'll be picked up again
they're still
soon.
working out. There was this meeting in 2015 where they kind of reviewed all the problems with it and all the promise of it. And so they did a bunch of studies in the interim. And so they're just trying to bring these studies together.
Hey, can I interrupt real quick? Do you guys have a timeline by which you think EPA might be looking at recommended water quality criteria for coliphage? If not next year, then any idea when?
I do not know.
No.
Fair enough.
All right. But it's on the cusp. Oh, shoot. And then, when you go swimming, it's not just bacteria or viruses that kind of can get you sick. You can also get sick from cyanotoxins. You guys know what cyanotoxins are, right? And so EPA started working on criteria for, it's probably in the next slide, for these toxins. There it is. So 304A criteria for microcystins and cylindrospermopsin. These are 2 of the most common toxins that are out there. And, it's designed to protect people on the beach. And we know that lots of states have been working on these, but the guidelines are all over the place. We wanted to have a 304A criteria for that. And so this slide is old because it says that we're expecting a final document in FY 2019. Well, it's been published, it's final, it's on the EPA website. So if you're interested, take a look at it. I have the numbers right here, right there. I think it's 4 and 8 micrograms per liter. Let me just look over here.
Right, the final criteria is 8 micrograms per liter for microcystins and 15 micrograms per liter for cylindrospermopsin.
Yeah,
and
that's
it was
right.
issued, I think, May 23rd and is up on EPA's website.
What is our take-home message? So we recommend the use of culturable methods for E. coli and Enterococcus. We give you 2 options for risk. We're encouraging where you work out the bugs to use qPCR because it's faster. And we're working on the coliphage, and we just finished the cylindrospermopsin and microcystin numbers. If you want more information, go to these websites or just Google it, which is what I do. That's it. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What are the human health impacts from cyanobacteria?
Well, I'm not the expert on that, but I think a lot of it is skin, and I think the epidemiology is based on kidneys that are, thank you.
Also not an expert, but I have worked with the Standards and Health Protection Division to work on implementation materials that we hope will be helpful for states looking to adopt the criteria. And we'll be putting the draft materials out within a month or so for public comment. Terry's correct, though. A lot of it is skin irritation, but in the long term, there are some studies that show liver and kidney effects from the various toxins, also effects to animals and pets. So there's been there's a database with the CDC called OHABS where they report individual cases of illnesses, and that's a good source of information for some of the effects that have been reported. And then I think that we've covered some of it in the implementation materials, but the health effects documents associated with the new criteria will give more detail on that too.
If I recall from the draft, which I read, that the criteria number was based on the kidney studies?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meredith.
Yeah, Meredith.
So actually, I have a comment and a question for you guys. So a couple other diseases, I don't remember if you specifically mentioned these, but cyanotoxins have been linked to non-alcoholic liver disease as well as ALS are two. And then my question is, isn't there a webinar on Thursday morning? Did I see that come through my email yesterday?
You know what, I don't know any, Joe's been, is part of our California Cyano HABs work, and I don't know if there is or not.
And I've been in Academy World, so I haven't checked my email.
It is on Thursday morning from 11 to 1.
Hopefully they tape it. Yeah.
Well, this is a good time, though, to point out that the CCHAB, the California Cyano Harmful Algal Bloom Network, is a resource that's available even within California to really trying right now to put out some tools for identifying when you have a bloom, at what levels you may want to. This was before EPA released your recommended criteria. But at what levels it's recommended on kind of our end to put up a sign warning against recreation or going into the river. Kind of some procedures then for doing some additional sampling so you know when to take the sign down again. So right now it's really kind of primarily focused on how to manage blooms and how to respond, and hopefully in the future we'll start getting into causes of the cyanotoxic blooms and potentially even how to mitigate for it. But right now it's kind of more of a response mode. And then the other thing that I just want to add as far as impacts from cyanoHABs is there's a lot of potential for dog deaths as they get into the river or the lake and they lick their fur. So we've probably seen that as a repercussion more than the human health impacts, although there certainly are those that we're worried about as well.
I just turned this off. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Rebecca mentioned the dog deaths being one of the big problems in California. The other one that it's hard to really quantify or measure is to cattle, because a lot of the cattle ranchers aren't really willing to share a lot of their information, but we do know that there's sometimes they have cattle ponds and things, and those end up having a lot of cyanotoxins in them. I had a question going back to bacteria, though, too. When I was involved in it a while ago, now it seems like a lifetime ago almost, one of the things that came up a lot was trying to determine, we talked about source determination, and that there was coming up with new DNA methods of being able to determine whether the E. coli was from human E. coli or cattle or other birds or other sources. Has there been more work in that area?
I think the latest is pretty old. I think it's the Bacteroides HF is the one that folks have been using to identify potential human sources, and a lot of folks have been using that to try to identify if an epi study or a QMRI is even worth doing. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been wondering about the possibilities of trying to do more direct testing on the viruses of interest, and so I don't know if you have any ideas about the feasibility of looking at the 7 viruses or protozoa directly in a more intense way. So after, in a TMDL context, maybe to say, okay, we're not meeting the standards yet, but we've had good reductions in bacteria, then, should we look at these other specific viruses of interest?
Yes, I don't know how to do virus testing, so I think it has to do with cell lines and growing stuff on it. But essentially, if you do that, what you're going down the road on is a quantitative microbial risk assessment, and that would be a useful thing to do. I'm done. All right, thanks.